Okay. Thank you, Anupam, for inviting me to this conversation. I am really delighted to be part of this. And also, I think this is the first time that you and I are personally talking to each other. Of course, I've heard
Yes.
about you and about your performance practice. And I have been hoping that we are in a conversation with each other, perhaps not this publicly, but uh, you know, I think it's uh, a good time as any to begin talking to each other. And a bit of about myself. I am. Um, I call myself a performance-based artist. I started by doing theater in my undergraduate and graduate level, and then went on to sort of move from theater towards performance making, towards performance art, as well as now I make films and installations and photography. So I think there's been some kind of a broadening of and crossing over of disciplinary boundaries in the last few years. But theater is my first love, and I think that's the pivot from which I have expanded my practice into other zones as well. I'm uh, you know, I think half the time I practice, I make my own work, and the rest of the time I'm teaching. I teach at the National School of Drama and also at the MFA at Shiv Nandar University, and at several other universities where I get to invite. So I'm invited to take lectures, and I take a broad sort of base of lectures from performance to interactive art to um, thinking about architecture or technology in performative ways, in ways in which it sort of interacts and affects the body, affects people who inhabit these spaces and these devices. Yeah, so that's what I do.
You know, you are involved into the theater as well. You are involved into the performance as well. So somehow these are very contradictory things. You know, one is performing art and one is performance art. They are always fight. So being you as a person, how you deal with those area, you know, uh, always performance art is denied performing art, and it's kind of very difficult to understand, you know. So how you deal with it? This is like a very personal ideological question to you.
I mean, that's an important question. I think we should be asking this question in the art field and performance field in India. It seems to me that that there were very strict disciplinary boundaries in the 20th century, and if you sort of look at the birth of performance art in the middle of the 20th century, there is in fact a manifesto that a collective of artists write, which is exactly the opposite of theatrical practice. Um, so when these bunch of visual artists get together, they look at theater and they make a list of all the characteristics, all kinds of practices, assumptions, expectations, and modes of display that make theater. And they write exactly an anti-theater manifesto, which goes on to become, a guideline for performance art. I enjoy reading that a lot. I refer to that when I teach in universities. But I also am aware of the fact that in the last 20 or 30 years, both disciplines have found more common in each other. And also, I think there are these overlapping concerns that have emerged, where theater has challenged a lot of its modern history, a lot of expectations, and has moved away from the convention. Um, and on the other hand, we also see some performance artists using theatrical convention in their practice, using the idea of character, for example, or using the idea of persona, using the idea of narrative, of gesture, um, and also using the idea of prop or material, you know. And I think similarly in theater, we've seen a move away from the actor to, say, performing real life itself, uh, and to do away with conventions of fiction, um, and of a clear divide between what is theater and what is reality, blur that border a little bit. So, so what we see in the last, I would say, 20 years is that the boundary that separated performance art from performing art is blurred. We see this in dance as well. You know, post Pina Bausch, we've seen that there is um, sort of a yearning, a desire to leave what we know as dance behind and to explore other states of body, um, which might be truer to the self. And I think these sort of blurring of boundaries in the recent times has indeed raised a question of what is the opposition that is left between performance art and performing art. And is it possible for artists to have a cross-disciplinary practice, to be able to transcend these boundaries and to think of their practices not confined by discipline, by form, but I think to think about sort of philosophical provocations, which can be carried into different forms itself. I have maintained that actually, I mean, theater is quite a composite art form. It has, of course, the performer and the performing body, but it also has scenery, it also has space design, and it also has narratives, it has text, and it has writing, it has music, um, and it also has a deep sort of care for the audience, of how the spectator, how the audience is going to engage with the pieces. And it's all of these concerns, I think, that I have carried into other disciplines as I have practiced. So I've carried the concern for the audience into the pieces I've made in interactive art, for example, where I think about what is it to activate the space of the audience? What is it to you know, what is the kind of question we ask when we invite somebody to participate um, in a piece, um, and we open the doors to audience as participants, to viewers who can act upon the artwork, the performance that they are watching. I've taken my sort of fascination for the visual into photography, and into film. I've produced a couple of films. I've produced a series of photographs, and I've also taken my sort of, you know, my understanding of what the body is, what is the performer's body, into performance art myself. So I've performed, I've made pieces in which I have performed myself. So it's almost as if that my sort of foundation in theater has now branched out into these different disciplines. And I don't necessarily see them as different disciplines. I know that these disciplines have, of course, a very rich and complex history of their own, but um, I don't necessarily see them as mutually um, sort of exclusionary sort of disciplines. For me, photography talks to the body talks to the viewer talks to the space then again talks back to the body. And I think it's this kind of this interaction of different, this dynamic is what I'm interested in to explore in my practice.
Yeah, you talk about that theatricality. I think being an performance artist, that in India, I have seen lots of theatrical element because our life is so much theatrical in India, Indian social life. So I think theatrical impact came into the performance art scene. Is it? How do you see that?
I think the South Asian region is extremely rich and very, very complex. You look at the hundreds of sort of rituals that we are surrounded by, and hundreds of years of tradition that our families and our communities inherit. I think that our culture is very layered in how it understands and imagines the body. So it's not just the fact that our cultures are theatrical. Of course, they are extremely theatrical, but I think they also, uh, they haven't exhausted the possibilities of imagining the human body. And this is what fascinates me a lot. That a large part of, say, performance art is ritualistic. It tries to reimagine, revisit, and transform a ritual performance. In fact, some performance practitioners actively ritualize, they produce a ritual in their performances. And I think that um, in some senses that there is a subconscious reference to the culture of rituals and traditions that we come from. Um, I mean, look at the kind of performance artists in Latin America, for example. Uh, look at Argentina, look at Brazil, look at Mexico. Uh, you know, and Bolivian artists, they're absolutely fabulous, um, and they are also, I think, in some senses, feeding off the rich ritualistic cultures they come from, but also questioning the culture, also provoking, also borrowing, and also giving back through their performance practices to their cultures. And so I think we are engaged in a very interesting relationship with our cultures as performance practitioners.
Yes. So you talks about the body. So how do you bring the politics of identity into your work and in the Indian context? Because in Indian context, the identity very much matters. You know, now we can see the idea of identity, that migrant labor, the identity as a artist, identity as a, you know, bureaucrats or corporate. So the identity matters always in the society. So what is the important in your work, and how do you bring those elements, you know, consciously, or, you know, it's obviously you conscious or unconscious, it's there. It's always came as an identical thing. So yeah.
Yeah, like I said, I don't think my work, performance work, directly deals with the idea of identity. Um, my performance work revolves mostly around philosophical questions around performance, and sometimes also political questions, but not sort of these direct, uh, indirect ways of what is my identity and what is, the identity of my body in performance. But just to give you an example of how I explored this in my work, I made a piece very early on in my sort of career, uh, probably the second or the third piece that I made, and this was a theater play, um, but it was a kind of work which stayed with me for a very long time, because it started with the question of identity, but then it sort of entered other realms as I developed this work. And this piece is called. Uh, so I'm going to share my screen now. Um,
Yes.
can you see it?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's
So so a lot of my work is now finally archived onto my website, and this took a very long time to do, and it was very difficult. Somebody had asked me once, when they visited my website, they'd asked me, how is it that I am able to categorize my work into these different categories of performance, theater, interactive art, installation, video, and curation? How is it that I take these decisions? And I mean, I had not thought of this when I started working, that as an artist, you don't think that you're going to now make theater, and now you're going to make performance, and now you're going to sort of make a photograph, or make an installation. I think I have been responding to the contextual need of my time, and depending on what seemed necessary, what seemed urgent, what seemed like an artistic response that was asked of me, I gave it that. And it's only years after, when I sat down to sort of put my work online, is when I started to ask myself, how will this make sense to anybody who comes to visit, to see this work? Um, and like I said, I started from theater, so I'm going to go to a very early work of mine that I made, which is called Electronic City. Now, this work is based on a German text by Falk Richter, and this is a work that is the rise of the 24/7 networked capital, global city, where nobody sleeps, where everything and everybody is understood within the premise of work. Are you productive and are you valuable? Um, and I like this text because I think what this text did was something quite fascinating. It took a fictional story of a husband and a wife. Here you see the husband in this photograph, and there you see his wife. Now they are separated by hundreds of miles. The husband is a corporate executive. He flies all the time, and he's always staying in hotels. He's always in airplanes. He's always at airports. He's always in hotels. And it sort of represents, his character represents a class of people that we in India saw emerging in the late 90s, with the global capital coming in, with the economic liberalization, uh, and with sort of this new money, management money, or sort of the corporate money coming in. I made this play in 2007, and by that time, this sort of class, this demographic, had made an entire city by themselves, and it is called Gurgaon. Um, and I had sort of virtually sort of seen this city emerge from nothing, from on top of barren land, into these massive glass buildings, which were opaque. You could not see inside them. And I think that at that time I thought that this kind of needed a response from me. So I picked up this play, this text, and here in the text, the husband, like I said, is a character who is always traveling and is always flying. He's always at airports, and his wife works at an airport. She works behind a sandwich bar. Um, and the two characters in the play seem to be stuck in a moment of amnesia. And this moment of amnesia is brought upon by the delirium of the world they inhabit, the delirium of the world they live in, which is uh, progressing at such a massive speed that it somehow has uh, sort of, when it somehow gives you the experience of stillness, that somehow you're not moving at all when you're moving that quickly. um, and so this is a play that lasts an hour, but the moment that these two characters are stuck in is actually just a second long. And the entire hour of this performance, these two performers um, perform that 1 second of amnesia that both of them experience. And so, we had to ask this question, that how does one perform the body that is in paralysis of time? How does one perform a body that is transmitting a moment of amnesia, a moment of kind of lost stillness across an hour long of stage presence? And I think that it is from here that I started to ask questions of the political body, the body that is um, the body that is lost, the body that is missing, the body that is not seen, um, the body that is somehow invisibilized, um, and that we had to come up with a new sort of we had to invent our own performance techniques. We had to invent different kinds of physical exercises to prepare these two performers to do this play on stage. And I remember this very clearly still, that every time we finished this show, that it took the performers 15-20 minutes to stop quivering after the show um, ended. And that was because that this kind of performance on stage sent their bodies sometimes into involuntary quiver, um, which was still within their control, of course, because they're trained performers, but that the affect of this did not just immediately stop as the show ended. And I think it was this state of the body that the performers had to put themselves into, which um, directed me towards new questions about the body of the 21st century. Um, and so these are so I and this sort of piece, um, 20 years later, transformed for me into this piece, called sort of Leaky Folds, um, in which I took a 6-month long uh, employment, sort of a fake employment in an IT company, and went into work as an employee, in disguise, actually, um, and learned digital labor, learned to code, learned to service tickets, learned to perform basic technical maintenance services on server farms and on websites. Um, and then sort of reflect upon what is the condition of this new digital labor that uh, we are performing. What are the new questions that political questions about labor, about body, about contracts, about value, um, about leisure, about passion, this sort of world is generating. And it was through that immersion into this what I call occupational realism, um, that I was able to make a note of these questions and also create performances inside the company to counter these forces, these sort of new forces of capital and of globalization. So, so as you can see, um, that from these two works, one is theatrical. It happened on stage, and I had directed it, and the other is where I chose to go in myself as an imposter, but to sort of insert disruptions into a very real space, um, and to insert different kinds of body movements, different kinds of useless tasks within a massively purposeful economic machinery, um, to, I think, in some senses, to tease out questions of value and uselessness upon which our contemporary world is hinged. You know, and in this sense, I think the question that we were talking about right in the beginning of the distinguishing factor between performance art and performing art. These are the two projects that I would offer for contemplation around how the distinction might be more blurred than we think it is. And it is quite possible for artists to now think in cross-disciplinary ways, um, and to bring sort of the philosophical practice of one's discipline to inform the practice of another discipline.
Yeah. So in that way, performing art and also performance art, there are two things, like one is method or methodology. It's used in performing art, used in performance art as well. So simplified way, it is a plan or planning the idea, conceptualize the idea. And other thing is that there is a term called improvisation. So both are using in both form. So how do you observe that method and improvisation in performance art?
I think all projects are improvised. Uh, it's impossible to script everything in performance, and this is something that I learned as a director fairly early, uh, that even conventional theater has to open up to improvisations, um, and also to, I think, the energy and the relational forces of the present. So in that sense, I think performance is rare uh, a very rare entity. As more and more of our world becomes recorded, becomes technologized, becomes mediated, performance becomes that sort of uh, performance becomes more unique in a sense, because I think that today performance is able to ask um, questions of the moment, questions of ephemerality, questions of um, um, things that cannot be captured in any way, things that will always and always be so I say that, I mean, to me performance is immeasurable in that sense, that not just the fact that, like, I think object based art, which can open up to different interpretations, performance also does open up to different interpretations, um, but that it's precisely the fact that performance's power uh, is more in its memory, is more in its in the fact that it will always be lost, um, in a world in which we are archiving everything. I think this is why performance for me is very close to my heart, and it will become more and more unique, I think, as it goes on. Um, and I think in this sense, many performers do not also want to rehearse their pieces before they perform, because this uniqueness of performance is not just for people who watch it, but also for the doer. And this is one thing that I think uh, this is one thing that sort of kept theater and performance art apart. That conventional theater has so many rehearsals to prepare a piece, that I think that the piece is ready even before the audience has seen it. Um, and in that sense, I think these mechanisms of theater were um, sort of pre-cinematic, in a sense, that these exercises and this understanding of theater was pre-cinematic. And by saying that it was pre-cinematic, what I mean is that the um, to be able to sort of produce theater, and then to be able to repeat the same piece over and over and over and over again, is something that I think finally gets gratified in cinema. This urge that finally gets gratified in cinema. Um, and I think that post cinema and post television, theater had to sort of answer this question of repetition, of how do we make a piece, and how, I mean, what is the sort of meaning of repetition within theatrical practice. Of course, performance artists responded to this idea by saying that they will never want to uh, do the piece. They only think about it, or they only prepare for it. And the piece itself is what happens when it takes place. Uh, and so that performance artists not only the fact that they do not rehearse their piece, but they also do not repeat the piece once it has happened. And this is interesting because I think performance artists are responding to the history of object art and their training in object art, where I think it is not so much a rebellion against conventional theater than it is a rebellion against the object itself that defines visual art practice. Remember that in theater, because the fetish of the object is not there, uh, actors and directors want to hold on to their plays for as long as they can, and therefore the idea of repetition was there. And I think you rightly asked the question that improvisation is the disruption, the puncture uh, in theater as well as in performance art. I think that that's one disruption that sort of makes the wall that divides performance art and performing art porous. Because what improvisation does is that it opens up your piece to being vulnerable. It opens up your piece to the moment which defines it, which shapes it itself, so that one is able to sort of say that um, that whatever happened happened, and that there was no right or wrong way to go ahead and do a piece, because it was not rehearsed, and that it was not, um, in a sense, already seen or already done before the piece occurred in front of the audience. I have actually sort of throughout my practice, um, almost every work of mine is improvised. Um, I never work with texts at all. Um, I do not work with rehearsals at all. Um, so I have a sort of a, sort of a personal manifesto for myself, and one of the things that I follow is to be over prepared but under rehearsed. To prepare obsessively for a piece, and I sometimes take up to a year to prepare for a performance, for a work, um, but never rehearse it. Um, and so, uh, in the piece that I showed right now, of going to a company and working for 6 months, how does one rehearse that piece? I mean, there is no way to uh, control that piece at all,
That's
and
true.
and their improvisation becomes the living material through which you're wading. It's almost like a strategy through which you're wading um, your so the life that surrounds you, and making performance through it as it goes. And I don't think that we even call it improvisation now. I mean, I think that sort of the word improvisation has collapsed into the word of performance itself. That it is not. It is. I mean, for me, it's not conceivable to think about performance without thinking about improvisation. Um, and and similarly, I think um, a lot of work that I did, in which I invited audiences to perform as well. Um, the audiences needed to improvise. They did not come in with rehearsal or with preparation. Um, and I think improvisation is risky. It makes people vulnerable. It opens up the piece to unintended and extremely surprising uh, sort of forces, questions, and they then become the piece itself. They then become performance itself. So it's almost as if you take performance, and then you sort of, as a sculptor, you sculpt in the unpredictability of time and space and the social surrounding, and that is what gives performances its final shape.
Yeah, so it is a very interesting questions that how do you observe contemporary, performance art in India, or your maybe critique, your maybe observation or admiration, or whatever. How do you see, being
I
an
Yeah.
artist? Yeah,
Um, I'm quite fascinated by the performance art scene in India. I mean, I admire your work. I haven't gotten to see it live, but whatever I've seen online, and I've read about your work, I really admire the kind of work that you do. I admire Inder Salim's work a lot. Um, um, and I mean, I think that there are a handful of several sort of visual artists who also work with performance as one of their disciplines. Um, but I do think that while individual practices are quite exciting, um, we do not have the scene has not sort of matured enough to have its own discourse. And while all of us are sort of, uh, practicing and making work in our own individual capacities, there isn't a sort of a, right now, there isn't a discursive frame within which one can talk about these different practices, and have a sort of evolve a dialogue out of it. And I think that is what I think we need at this time, for a platform to emerge, for a forum to emerge, for writing around these performance practices to emerge in a way in which they are not just uh, they're not just observations of individual practices, but also a larger social critique, artistic critique of different practices and of an entire scene of performance art that has emerged across the country. And it is only then that we will be able to see on a macro level if there are any common concerns that all of us have. Um, but like I said, till then, I think I think this dialogue that we're having is extremely precious, um, and I hope that you have more and more dialogues like this with other practitioners as well, and we are able to sort of reach a point where um, these where one can glean uh, sort of generational concerns or concerns of a certain sort of moment to emerge from our practices. But that's missing right now.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, that's very true. Somewhere we need a platform, and yeah, writings, magazines, or discourse, seminars, which is very lag. But the point is that who is going to talk about? Who are the people? Because nowadays it's very difficult. It's also one kind of belief. Now someone has to believe in the form of art, and then they will develop writing, or they will start creating the dialogue within it. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, Amit, anything you want to add? I think we are almost, not almost, discussion never ends. But anything you want to add, or you want to ask, or you want to give a comment on this conversion or in performance art?
um, yeah, no, I think, I mean, for me, I think, there are several more uh, sort of personal questions I have around performance. Like I said, I call myself a performance-based practitioner because I think for me, performance is not about so much about um, what comes out, but it is for me a mode of thinking as well. And I think I'm interested in sort of the idea of um, knowing through doing, um, and what is it that performance can tell us, which no other art form can express. And I think this is the question that we need to think about a little bit more, about what is it that performance artists do, what is the work of performance artists. When we perform and when we make a work, and we sort of, it gets viewed and received, what is it that we have done, what is the kind of meaning that we have sort of evolved, and therefore, what is performance in itself. And I think that through individual practices in India, we have some very exciting definitions, some very exciting sort of proposals uh, to in this direction. And I think it would be nice to sort of for it to coalesce into some kind of a discursive frame as we move along. Because remember that um, remember that, I mean, that, both theater and performance art have the same enemy, which is uh, the market. Um, and that sort of, and this is another common sort of rallying point between theater practitioners and performance artists, is that the the forces of the market are um, anathema to our practices. But yet, I think that this is something that theater also has to do, is to answer this question of how does one carry on with one's practices, knowing that state patronage for these art forms is uh, diminishing, is non-existent now. Um, and sort of how does one sort of now how does one develop an ecosystem within which these forms can also thrive. uh, we are living through this pandemic, and the one of the first sort of uh, one of the first communities to be affected by this are performers, actually. That
Yeah.
theaters were shut down. And when you have a lockdown on public assembly, then it is no longer possible to perform anymore. And we are seeing this with visual art, that many of the visual art galleries and museums, at a huge cost, are actually moving online. Um,
Yeah.
but what does one do with performance? I mean, it's almost as if that at each juncture we are asked these very threatening questions. We are asked almost these existential questions about our practice, and we seem to be what we practice seems to be so fragile, so vulnerable, that just as that a simple sort of sometimes a very small shift within the social circumstance um, completely throws our practice and what we do several miles away, and we are again uh, we are at a new periphery, at a new margin, as if we were not already marginalized as artists before. And I think we need to sort of turn this in our practice. We need to bring this question um, into our thinking, uh, and say, how is it that we now um, I mean, some part of my work is only on the internet, for example. It is thought through the politics of the internet. It takes internet as its space and as its time um, to to be performed in a sense. So, for example, I in 2014 and 15, I made a sleep festival which was entirely on the internet. Um, and that sleep festival was sort of a political and philosophical question around issues of sleep, and how sleeping as an experience is not just an innocent experience, but also an experience of power, of privilege, um, of sort of these extremely ambiguous um, sort of questions that come as we experience sleep in many different ways, and also sort of it opened up the history of sleeping. Um, but it, but I decided to create it on the internet to counter the 24/7 wakefulness that internet has sort of pushed us into. Um, and I wanted to think about unavailability of inactivity, of opaqueness, of making oneself receding, of of sort of, of salvaging those spaces, those experiences, um, which are not performative. So some part of my work actually is anti-performance. I am often interested in sites which have very little to do with performance. Um, so sleep was one, and I'm also interested in sort of pieces in which one really cannot tell life from performance, um, because I mean, I think for me, um, performance is actually practice. It is always in the making. It is never. I cannot ever say that this performance was its final piece. So, for example, the IT work that I did. Now, which day of the 6 months that I went in was the day of performance? Was it the beginning? Was it the ending? Was it all of 6 months? But then those 6 months of going in gave me a lot of gave me impetus to make a series of photographs and a film around it as well. So would those sort of artworks be then the final outcome? But I never talk about those. They're on display and they're there. I always talk about the 6 months immersion that I did. So I think, I mean, I really think that that performance is never final, in a sense that it's and and performance artists are always producing just iterations of themselves, which is why it's interesting to sort of follow performance artists, um, because they're we it's interesting to look at their pieces, and just and to make sense of the kind of life that they're leading, because if there is no difference between performance and practice, then there is really no difference between practice and performance. So it's almost as if saying that anything that is being practiced uh, can be a performance, can lead one to perform something. Um, and I mean, one of my favorite pieces uh, of performance art actually is of a performance artist um, dragging a massive cube of ice across the city, um, till it melts and disappears entirely. And what it does is that it leaves the trace of melting ice, water on the city, on the city floor, and that also evaporates. Um, and so the question that one could ask here is, where did where did this performance lie? When was the moment of performance? In the pushing of the ice, in the disappearance of the ice, in the labor that was produced, in the sweat that was produced, um, in the memory of people who saw that being pushed, um, in the photographs that got produced. Um and I think it is quite interesting to see performance as a multiplicity of all these sort of um, interventions, of all these ways of capturing it that suddenly sort of take birth um, around a moment, you know. Um, and in that sense, I think that for me will always be the central question of performance itself. It's like, well, what is really happening when I perform, and what am I really seeing when I'm seeing a performance? These are eternal questions for me.
Yeah, I think we are almost more than 1 hour. I think it's a quite a lot material for us. Yeah, I think thank you.
You're welcome. I really enjoyed this,
Yeah.
and yeah, hope to stay in touch with you.
Yes,
Do
sure. We will
yeah,
do something
yeah.
together
Hope,
because collaboration is very important nowadays, I think.
Yeah, and hope to get to work with you and to see you soon.